Your severance pay is 20 cents, as per the work rules minus 20 cents for 20 years, Chris stated. I paid it out of my own pocket, he said with a big smile. Chris handed me the severance compensation, which was explicitly identified as 20 years of service or more, after I tried to argue that it couldn't be the work regulations. It was unbelievable to me that they would put up such a cunning plan to get a disgruntled employee quit. And tremendous sensation of wrath swept over me. As they say, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I have my own methods for dealing with them if that's how they want to play. Keeping my anger in check, I said icily, I will resign as per the company rules. I'm Tom Wilson, and I recently celebrated my 46th birthday. At the moment, I work in an office for a trucking firm in a little Nebraskan town. Since I've always been interested in computers, I was hired by a New York-based firm after completing an information processing technical school. However, the constant workload finally caught up with me, and I was completely worn out. My health collapsed during my 6th year of employment. I made the decision to relocate to a small town as a result of this. I wanted to live a more laid-back life in the country rather than be swept up by the busy city life. I initially looked for a position where I could put my skills to use, but I was unable to locate a company that met my requirements. Since no businesses in this location were interested in hiring me as a systems engineer, I made the decision to set aside my preferences and begin searching for any open positions. This is how I got to work for the trucking firm I currently work for. I did all I could at the trucking company where I was hired, including ordering supplies, managing operations, assisting with bookkeeping, and even locating new customers. The CEO at the time actively considered employee comments and welcomed ideas without being constrained by conventional wisdom. With the support of such an open business culture, my life became more valuable every day. I became aware that I had 20 years of experience with the organization. I am now the center of the business. I've never been overly worried about money since choosing to live in the country. Since I'm a free-spirited bachelor, I was content as long as I could work and live comfortably in a nice place. All I want is to stay in this place as long as possible and help the firm in any way I can. In order to increase productivity, I started subtly creating systems in my spare time and progressively incorporated them into the business's operations. As the foundation of the business, these systems are now indispensable. Since I developed them on my personal computer and brought them directly to the company, the CEO felt embarrassed. But I never intended to receive any compensation. I don't have any hobbies of my own, so playing with computers is like my only hobby. If it could help the company, then that's how I lived back then. But I soon faced a situation that shook this way of thinking. It happened about 2 years ago. The CEO suddenly fell ill and passed away. He had 2 sons. The eldest, Chris, worked at a company in New York, while the younger, David, worked at the same trucking company. Chris didn't have a good relationship with his father and was distant, so it was assumed that David would naturally take over. However, upon hearing of his father's death, Chris suddenly stepped forward as the successor. It seems that a combination of his divorce and his father's sudden passing sparked his ambition to take over the family business. This sparked a struggle for succession, and a bit of turmoil erupted within the company. Nevertheless, the majority of the employees favored David, who had the president's wishes in mind, and it was thought that the decision would be made easily. However, when the co-wife threw her support behind Chris, the situation took a sudden and dramatic turn. Chris was appointed as the new CEO. The fact that the co-wife had served as the company's executive vice president likely influenced the decision. Naturally, Chris and David clashed. David was popular among employees, and Chris had his mother on his side. David expressed dissatisfaction with Chris's methods, but Chris suppressed him by force. Once again, the outcome favored Chris, and David, who had been in opposition, was forced out of the company. Like many employees, I was disheartened. The previous CEO had favored a conservative management style, gradually growing the company over time. I'm convinced that this steady approach was well suited for a trucking company in a small town. However, Chris, who had just taken over as CEO, decided to overhaul the previous methods and pursue rapid expansion. This led to a sudden increase in the number of vehicles owned, and accordingly, the staff was also expanded. As the number of vehicles increased, so did the revenue. However, due to the sudden push for capital investment, the company's debt surged. Additionally, the decline in profit margins worsened the financial situation. Chris's attempt to force an urban-style business plan onto a company that had thrived on a conservative approach created serious problems. This situation drastically changed my working environment. While employees dissatisfied with Chris's methods began leaving in droves, new hires came in one after another. This completely changed the atmosphere of the company. With the decline in long-standing employees, I started noticing signs that they wanted to push me out as well, since I was so steeped in the previous president's way of thinking. One evening, I was summoned to the CEO's office. There, I ended up having an argument with Chris. He demanded that I support his expansion plan, while I, filled with a sense of impending crisis, warned that this path would lead the company to ruin. The discussion reached an impasse. Given the current situation, expanding operations is reckless, I said. There aren't as many clients in the countryside as in the city. Let's go back to basics and rebuild our foundation. I passionately argued my case. Having worked at this company for 20 years, I felt I should stand firm on the sound arguments backed by my experience. However, he outright rejected my stance. I'm not going to end my career at some crappy trucking company in this backwater town. I'm going to hit the big city and make a killing. If there are no clients in this town, we'll go find them elsewhere. The strong are the ones who win in the end. I understood that Chris had high ambitions, but to expand, we needed a solid foundation. Building a grand structure on weak ground would only lead to its collapse. We're too weak to venture into the city. If we keep expanding like this, we'll soon face serious cash flow problems. It's not too late to reconsider. Please think it over again, I told him. I knew that the company would go out of business before it could venture into the city, but he was having none of it. The bank will lend us as much money as we need, as long as we keep increasing sales. We'll be fine. We just need to step on the gas, he said. You have no idea what real business is like because you've been stuck in the slow-paced life of the countryside. If you've got a problem with it, then quit. Chris dismissed anyone who opposed him with a hardline attitude. Many employees had already left because of this, and I realized that the time had finally come. I prepared myself to resign. I loved this town, and the company had been a comfortable place for me. I had hoped to stay in this environment forever, but what I once sought was no longer here. It might be tough to find another job in this town, but anywhere would be better than staying here. I can't follow your direction any longer. Thank you for everything over the years, I told him. As I said this, Chris gave a sinister grin. So you're quitting? How though? I haven't done anything for you these past years anyway. Take this. Chris pulled out a brown envelope from his desk drawer and shoved it toward me. When I took it, I felt a slight weight in the otherwise blank envelope. What is this? I held the envelope up and could hear the faint sound of coins clinking inside. Open it up. You'll see it's your severance pay. Now take it and get lost, he told me. I opened the package, and inside I found a piece of paper that looked like a memo pad and 20 cents. Handwritten on the paper was the amount of the severance payment minus 20 cents. I couldn't believe my eyes at the absurdity. I've been with the company for 20 years, and this is my severance pay. Please stop joking, I said with a bitter smile. But Chris glared at me with a cruel look in his eyes. You say you've been here 20 years, but that was back when my old man was CEO. You haven't even worked a full year since I took over, so there's no severance pay for you. But I felt a little sorry for you, so I gave you this from my own pocket. You should be grateful and take it. Chris smirked with a look of triumph. No way, the company rules say. I began to protest, but he cut me off. Your severance pay is 20 cents, just as stated in the company rules. 20 cents for 20 years, Chris said, grinning from ear to ear. I couldn't believe this could be in line with company rules, so I tried to argue. But when I looked at the company rules, Chris had handed me the severance pay. It was clearly stated as 20 years of service or more on the cover, and the date of the last revision was stamped. It seemed that when Chris became CEO, He had the rules changed with approval only from certain employees, reducing the required years for severance pay eligibility. To think he'd go to such underhanded lengths to force out employees he didn't like. A surge of intense anger welled up inside me. Well, if that's how he wants to play, I've got my own ways to handle it. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I suppressed my agitation and coldly stated, I will resign as per the company rules. At my words, Chris showed a momentary look of surprise, but quickly relaxed and spoke. I appreciate your understanding. Thank you for everything. Please take care. With that, he waved his hand dismissively, as if to ward me off. He was probably pleased, thinking he had gotten rid of another nuisance. Since it was long past quitting time, everyone else had likely gone home. Alone in the empty office, I began packing up my personal belongings. I efficiently gathered everything from my desk and drawers and loaded them into my car. In just about an hour, the traces of my 20 years of service had vanished. As I stared at the empty desk, a sudden wave of sadness welled up inside me. But as soon as Chris's face flashed in my mind, those sentimental feelings evaporated. You'll regret this someday, I thought, burying it deep in my heart. I drove home. After returning home, I made a phone call to someone. Over beers, we talked at length, and by the time I crawled into bed, I was so exhilarated that I couldn't help but grin. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. Since I no longer needed to go to the company, I hadn't set my alarm clock. I checked the caller and found it was Chris. The moment I saw his name, I could picture the chaos likely unfolding at the company. What the hell do you think you're doing? The angry voice hit me as soon as I answered the call. Without saying a word, I hung up on him. It wasn't long before the phone rang again. Don't you dare hang up on me. Chris was shouting again. I figured he'd just keep calling back if I kept hanging up, so I put the phone on the table, leaving the call connected, and turned on the TV. Hey, don't ignore me. I know you're there. Pick up the phone. It's all your fault that everything's gone to hell. I could hear his voice coming through. I didn't need him to tell me because I already knew. I knew exactly what was happening at the company right now, and I was the one who caused it. Last night, I told Chris that I was quitting and took all my personal belongings home. This is the source of the trouble happening now. To explain, I had brought my personal computer to the company and used it as a server to run the internal systems. It's true that it could be seen as mixing personal and professional matters, but I did it out of goodwill. The previous CEO and Chris's younger brother, David, understood this and often expressed their gratitude. Tom, I'm really sorry for always relying on you. If we asked a company to set up a system like this, it would cost a fortune, right? Don't worry about it. It's my hobby. I'm just happy it helps the company. David and I were the same age and had a friendly relationship, so I never hesitated to use my personal computer at work or to provide my custom-made systems. But that was because of my bond with the previous CEO and David. I don't feel any debt of gratitude to Chris, who would send me away with 20 cents in severance pay. In fact, I wanted nothing more than to see him brought down. Hey, I know you're listening. Get to the office right now and get the system running. Chris continued to shout. It sounded almost like a prisoner in a cage throwing a tantrum, which I found oddly amusing. I considered ignoring him for a while, but the noise was irritating, so I decided to respond. You don't need to shout as I can hear you just fine, I said lightly, causing Chris to raise his voice. What did you do to the company's system? Is this payback for your severance? Sabotaging the company is a crime. If you don't want to get sued, fix it right now. He has no idea what he's done. He forced me out without understanding the consequences. Well, it's time he learned just how foolish that decision was. With all due respect, I only followed the company's rules and took all my personal belongings home. I just took all of my personal belongings home with me as per the company's work rules. I believe it is written in the revised work rules, isn't it? He choked on his words and must have had a lot of things he couldn't sort out. In other words, you were all logging into my computer, which was acting as a server. Yesterday, I took that computer home. Of course, it was my personal computer, so it's no wonder it wasn't working. I said in a light tone, and I could hear a groan on the other end of the line. If I had retired under proper circumstances, I would have been fine with leaving the computer and system for you to use. But when you offer me a 20-cent severance, even I can't be that generous. You said the severance pay is in accordance with the work rules, so I complied with the work rules and was allowed to leave your company. I pressed on as he struggled to find words. Then, in a tone that sounded like he was trying to cover up, he said, "Is it money you want? Is that it? I'll pay you. How much? How much do you want?" Does he really think this is just about money? Chris's words only made me more stubborn. "I don't want your money. I'm not about to take your money and start following your orders," I said firmly. Chris's voice became strained. "Just name your price. I'll buy the computer and system from you. How about $20,000? You can't complain about that, right?" Offering $220,000 after saying he'd name my price, I was too shocked to even respond. I had no intention of selling it for any amount, but with that attitude, I figured I might as well have some fun with him. $220,000? You've got the wrong number of zeros. If you're really serious, how about $2 million? Then I might consider it, I said while trying to hold back my laughter. His voice cracked. $2 million? Are you out of your mind? Who in their right mind would pay $10 million for that? Of course, he was right. I threw out a ridiculous number, knowing he couldn't pay it. "So you can't pay that? Well, that's too bad. I guess we're done negotiating then." I coldly dismissed him. But he kept pushing. He must have been really desperate, but this is just the consequence of his own actions. By cutting off veteran employees one after another, he has put himself in a position where he has no choice but to rely on the system I built. "Wait a minute. I can't pay you $2 million, but how about I rehire you? I'll even give you a raise, so bring the computer back right now. No one else in this town is going to hire you. I'm offering you a great deal. How could you complain?" Even at this point, he still seemed to think he holds the upper hand. It's time to make it clear to him. "Sir, I think you're misunderstanding something. I've already secured a new job. We finalized everything last night." His voice trailed off in disbelief. The truth is, the person I called last night was Chris's brother David. After being forced out by Chris, David had joined a major trucking company with branches all over the country. That company was opening a new branch in this town. David has been appointed as the director. He had the advantage of being able to bring over employees who were dissatisfied with Chris, and as someone with deep connections to various companies in this area's logistics industry, he had a strong network. In a short time, David had steadily built up his accomplishments and established a solid reputation, so it was easy for them to bring me on board. That's why I'm taking this system I built over to David's company. I don't know how much they'll use it, but it's better than leaving it with a company that offered me a 20-cent severance pay. So you'll have to give up on my system. But don't worry, you'll manage without it. After all, everything used to be done manually back in the day. The fact that I was moving to David's company seemed to be a real blow to Chris. Given everything that had happened, he probably realized that there was nothing he could do now that I'd gone to his brother. Chris muttered something in a resigned tone and hung up the phone. I heard later that the chaos at the company lasted for over 3 months. During that time, revenue was cut in half. Eventually, they had to hire a contractor to customize an existing system, which finally helped them pull through the crisis. But it cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. You could say they paid the price for being stingy with my severance. As for me, I joined David's company and got back to the same kind of relationship we had before. Many of my new colleagues were former employees of Chris's company. So while the workplace has changed, the familiar atmosphere is returning. It was disappointing to only get 20 cents as severance, but I'm enjoying great benefits at my new job. Most importantly, I get to stay in this town and work in a place I'm happy with. Things couldn't have turned out better for me. Meanwhile, I'm hearing from David that Chris's company is going through a tough time. Chris's company is in pretty bad shape. David muttered as we shared a beer at a bar near the station. Both David and I are single, so we often find ourselves talking over beers like this. Has he said anything to you? I asked while picking at some edamame, and David shook his head. He'd heard about the trouble at Chris's company from a loan officer at the bank. Chris, who had ignored my warnings, continued with his expansion plans. That alone was a dangerous tightrope to walk, but when major transport companies entered the market, competition for shippers intensified, causing significant damage. The few months when the system wasn't operational caused sales to plummet, hitting the company's finances hard, like a body blow. All these issues compounded, leaving the company in a severe cash flow crisis. At the end of every month, they're scrambling to make payments. Every time, they're applying for short-term loans from the bank, but even that's reaching its limit. The bank is getting hesitant to lend any more money. After reviewing their financials, he sat down, pinging his beer with a bitter expression. If the bank refuses to lend even once, the company could bounce a check and face bankruptcy. It's clear that they're in a desperate situation. This is just, yeah. Our voices trailed off, filled with a shared sense of gloom. I didn't care if Chris had to face the consequences of his actions, but it's heartbreaking to see the company that the previous generation built fall apart. David and I both wished we could at least save the company. That was our mutual feeling. But both of us were just regular employees now. We weren't in a position to influence or save another company. What if you talked to your headquarters? Maybe your company could do something, I suggested. David's eyes lit up. I thought the same thing. So I spoke with headquarters about the possibility of acquiring Chris's company. As he stared at his beer, David's face gradually brightened. It turns out headquarters is keen on the idea. In exchange for taking on the debt of Chris's company, they will fully absorb the company into their group. If this deal goes through, it would lead to further expansion and allow them to dominate the delivery services in this area. The headquarters seems to be thinking along those lines. So the issue is, I hesitated. Chris might mean nothing to me, but to David, he's still his brother. If the company is acquired, they won't be able to keep Chris around. No matter what's happened, could David really turn his back on his brother like that? That thought crossed my mind. Don't worry. I've never thought of Chris as my brother. Not even once, David spoke with a twisted smile. It turns out there's no blood relation between him and Chris. David was separated from his parents at a young age, raised in an orphanage, and later adopted by the previous CEO. The late CEO doted on David, but his wife and Chris resented David, who suddenly came into their lives. David was mistreated by his adoptive mother and brother and harbors only resentment toward them, with no familial affection whatsoever. When the previous CEO passed away and the succession became an issue, it's likely that the previous president's wife supported Chris because of this backstory. To David, the only person he considers family is the late CEO. Then there's no hesitation. I looked into David's eyes, and he stared back at me with a clear, unwavering gaze. None at all. Knowing him, it won't be easy to convince him. Tom, I'm going to need your help. I nodded firmly. The plan to acquire Chris's company moved forward quickly. Initially, Chris had rejected the idea of an acquisition, but the situation changed dramatically when the bank threatened to cut off his loans. He found himself in a position where he could no longer resist the offer. We made to acquire the company, which was equivalent to its debt, but it didn't include Chris's personal loans. Apparently, when Chris became CEO, he took out loans to buy a condo and luxury cars. He probably thought that if he expanded the company quickly, everything would work out. These personal financial issues might have been driving his aggressive expansion strategy. Chris insisted on selling the company for an amount that would cover his personal debts and wanted to remain in a leadership role. On these points, David, who was handling the negotiations for our headquarters, clashed directly with Chris. As a result, a meeting was scheduled to discuss these matters. David asked me to attend with him, but since I had no reason to refuse, I gladly agreed. The meeting took place at Chris's company. It was the first time I faced him since the day he handed me that 20-cent severance. I'm not backing down. As soon as we exchanged brief greetings, he hit me with an opening punch. David and I exchanged glances. I don't think you're in a position to say that. If this deal falls through, you'll be stuck with all the company's debt. You should consider yourself lucky to avoid that. I kept my emotions in check and spoke calmly. Chris's face turned red with anger. Who do you think you are? Because of you, my company suffered huge losses. If it weren't for what you did, we could have ridden the wave of success. It seemed he was blaming the company's downfall on me for removing the computer system. But that wasn't the only reason things had gone wrong. That's the consequence of your own actions. Even without that incident, the outcome would have been the same. Your reckless management led to the collapse. I remained composed, refusing to rise to his provocation. He then turned his attention to David. What about you, David? Are you just going to follow his lead? I'm your brother. Of course, you'll be on my side, right? Chris sneered as he glared at David. David dropped his gaze to the table. He had said he never thought of Chris as a brother, but they were still siblings after all. It's not something he could easily dismiss, so it was up to me to take the lead. Sir, you have no right to negotiate. Your only choice is to accept our offer or reject it. If you reject it, our company will immediately withdraw, and you'll be left to deal with the company's debt and sink with it. That's all there is to it. He clicked his tongue in frustration, but realizing how dire his situation was, he changed his attitude and looked at me with pleading eyes. Can't you really include my personal debts? You're a big company. Surely you can do that much. No, we cannot. I responded without hesitation. Seeing that he couldn't sway me, Chris tried to find a compromise. Then at least let me stay on as president. If I lose my position, I won't be able to pay off my loans. Surely you can do that much, right? David, realizing that appealing to me was useless, turned his gaze toward David. David kept his head down, refusing to look up. Come on, David. We're brothers, aren't we? I'll do whatever you say. Under your company, it's a win-win. We're a family, so let's stick together and make this work. Seeing Chris talk so nonchalantly, anger welled up inside me. How could he be so low as to invoke the bond of brothers just to play on David's sympathy? I looked closely at David's face. It was filled with anguish. Don't do it, David. If you compromise now, it'll tarnish your reputation, I thought to myself. Then David, who had been staring at the floor, suddenly lifted his head. A slight smile began to form on his face. Chris looked puzzled by this change. That's the David I know. I knew you were smart. You're not like this stubborn fool sitting here. Let's team up and get things done. Chris rambled on, convincing himself that David's demeanor was a sign of support. He extended his right hand toward David. David just stared at that hand. A few seconds of silence passed, and as David slowly reached out his hand, a feeling of despair washed over me. It seemed that breaking the bond between brothers was impossible after all. But just as that thought crossed my mind, David suddenly slapped Chris's hand away with a sharp smack. What the hell are you doing? Chris's eyes went wide in shock, darting around in confusion. Brothers? I've been quietly listening to your nonsense, but enough is enough. I've never once thought of you as my brother. You think you can stay on as president? Don't make me laugh. Who do you think destroyed Dad's company? You're fired, effective immediately. And your severance? 2 cents in honor of your short tenure as CEO. I'll even pay it myself. With that, David pulled 2 cents from his pocket and tossed them at Chris. The force of David's words made Chris recoil. He tried to say something, but his lips trembled, and no words came out. He was clearly terrified by the determination David had just shown. With that, the matter was settled. Confident that the situation was now under control, I straightened my suit collar and spoke firmly. We'll finalize the contract on another day. Please prepare the necessary documents for now. We'll take our leave. With that, I left the room with David. As I closed the door and glanced back, Chris was sitting there, pale and staring blankly into space. He had realized that his last hope had been cut off, and he was out of options. Chris must have finally understood the dire situation he was in. Thank you, Tom. You were incredible, David said, shaking my hand firmly before we left the room. A few days later, the official contract was signed. I had been wary that Chris might cause more trouble, but surprisingly, he agreed to the deal without resistance. Perhaps seeing David's intense determination made him realize that there was no point in fighting. As a result, our company successfully brought Chris's company under our control. Meanwhile, Chris and his mother, who served as executive vice president, were dismissed and forced out of the company. Although the company's debt was taken care of through the acquisition, Chris was left with his personal debts to pay off. He sold all of his valuable assets, including his condo and cars. Even after liquidating everything, he couldn't cover all his debts, so his mother's assets were also used. It turns out that Chris's extravagant lifestyle had been quite excessive. Given the small-town environment, news of their downfall spread quickly. They became the subject of gossip wherever they went, and eventually, unable to bear the shame, the two of them disappeared without a trace. Even now, they might be living in fear of debt collectors somewhere. After that, I was appointed as the branch manager following the headquarters decision. Apparently, I was recognized for my relationship with David and my active role in the acquisition plan. The trucking company that Chris had driven to the brink of collapse is now being led by David as its president. He quickly restored the company's environment, and with the support of the parent company, it now operates under a healthy management structure. Then we received more good news. The headquarters decided to build a massive logistics warehouse in this town. With the opening of the highway interchange, this town will be positioned as a key distribution hub. This development is expected to lead to even greater growth moving forward. David and I will continue to work together, contributing to the company. Above all, the greatest joy is that we were able to preserve the trucking company that the late CEO built in this town.